Arrest this black delinquent! I didn't do anything! Let me go!
Keep moving!
Stop resisting!
Have you ever been accused of something you didn't do? Imagine being 13 years old, handcuffed, and dragged out of your classroom while everyone watches. Now imagine the thing they accused you of having was never real in the first place. This is the story of Terrell Washington, a brilliant autistic teenager whose world came crashing down because of one teacher's prejudice and a misunderstanding that would shake an entire community to its core. It was a crisp October morning at Riverside Middle School in suburban Atlanta, and Terrell Washington sat at his desk in Mrs. Patricia Holbrook's 8th grade English class, organizing his pencils by color. The 47-year-old teacher had been at Riverside for 23 years, and in her mind she knew exactly what kind of students succeeded and which ones would cause problems. Terrell, with his constant stimming, his need for routine, and his inability to make eye contact the way she expected, had been labeled a problem child in her book from day one. Terrell wasn't like the other kids and he knew it. Diagnosed with autism at age 5, he experienced the world differently. Loud noises felt like knives scraping against his brain. Eye contact made him feel like his skin was crawling. But he had his own brilliant mind, one that could memorize entire movie scripts after watching them once, one that understood patterns and details most people missed. His father, Julian Washington, had taught him that being different wasn't a weakness. It was a superpower. Julian Washington was a name whispered with reverence in Hollywood's prop departments. Starting from nothing, building replicas in his garage 20 years ago, he had become the go-to artist for creating hyper-realistic props for major film studios. Guns, jewelry, artifacts, you name it. If a movie needed something that looked absolutely real but was completely safe, Julian made it. His workshop, Washington Authentic Replicas, employed over 60 people and had credits on some of the biggest blockbusters of the past decade. But none of that mattered more to him than his son. That morning, Terrell had been excited. His father had just finished working on a replica of a vintage 1945 Colt pistol for an upcoming World War II film. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, made from resin and painted to perfection, complete with serial numbers and weathering that made it look like it had seen actual combat. Julian had shown it to Terrell the night before, explaining every detail of how he'd created the aging effects, the texture of the grip, the mechanics that made it look functional even though it could never fire. Terrell had been mesmerized. "Dad, can I take it to show Mr. Henderson?" Terrell had asked. Mr. Henderson was the history teacher, the one adult at school who actually seemed to understand Terrell, who let him info-dump about World War II history without making him feel weird about it. Julian had hesitated but then agreed, writing a detailed note explaining what the item was, sealing it in an envelope, and putting both the prop and the note in a padded case clearly labeled "Theatrical Prop, Not a Real Weapon, Washington Authentic Replicas." But that morning, everything went wrong in ways nobody could have predicted. Terrell arrived at school early as he always did. Routine was important to him. Crowds overwhelmed him. He went to his locker, put the prop case carefully inside, planning to bring it to Mr. Henderson during lunch period. But he forgot to close his locker all the way. It swung open while he was in first period. Patricia Holbrook was walking down the hallway during her planning period, coffee in hand, when she saw Terrell's open locker. She didn't like the boy. She'd made that clear in countless small ways throughout the semester. The way she'd sigh when he asked to leave class because the fluorescent lights were too much. The way she'd mark his perfectly correct answers wrong because he didn't show his work the way she wanted. The way she told his father during parent-teacher conferences that maybe Terrell wasn't cut out for a mainstream classroom. She peered into the locker and her breath caught. There, in the case, she could see what looked exactly like a gun. She didn't see the label. She didn't look for context. She saw a weapon, and in her mind, she saw confirmation of every prejudiced assumption she'd ever made about this black child who didn't fit her narrow definition of good student. Patricia Holbrook didn't go to the principal first. She didn't ask questions. She called 911. "I need police at Riverside Middle School immediately," she said, her voice shaking with what she convinced herself was fear but was really something else entirely. "There's a student with a gun. He's violent. He's aggressive. I've been documenting his behavior all semester. Please hurry." 20 minutes later, Terrell was in Mrs. Holbrook's class, reading ahead in the textbook because he'd already finished the assignment, when the classroom door burst open. 3 police officers stormed in, hands on their weapons, faces set in hard lines. The entire class froze. "Terrell Washington, stand up and put your hands where we can see them," the lead officer, a man named Officer Daniels, shouted. Terrell's mind went blank. The sudden noise, the aggressive tone, the eyes of 28 classmates and one smirking teacher all locked on him. It was too much. His body locked up, His hands started flapping at his sides, a self-soothing stim he couldn't control. He couldn't speak. He couldn't process what was happening. He's reaching for something. He's not complying. Patricia Holbrook shrieked from the back of the room, her voice hitting a pitch that made Terrell's ears ring. The officers rushed forward. Terrell felt hands grabbing him, spinning him around, forcing his arms behind his back. Cold metal bit into his wrists. Handcuffs. He was being handcuffed. His classmates were screaming. Someone was crying. The fluorescent lights were too bright, the voices too loud, everything was too much and he couldn't speak, couldn't explain, couldn't do anything but shake. "Where's the gun, son?" Officer Daniels demanded. "Where is it?" "His locker," Patricia Holbrook said, stepping forward with Terrell's locker key that she'd taken from the school office. "Number 217. I saw it myself. And I'm telling you, this boy has been trouble all year. Aggressive. Defiant. Always angry. I'm not surprised he brought a weapon to school. I tried to warn the administration." Every word she spoke was a lie built on bias. Terrell had never been aggressive. The times she'd called him defiant were moments when sensory overload made him shut down. The anger she claimed to see was anxiety and fear in a child who processed emotions differently than she expected. But she spoke with such conviction that the officers believed her. They dragged Terrell out of the classroom in handcuffs, his feet barely touching the ground. Students lined the hallways, phones out, recording everything. Terrell's mind was screaming, but his mouth wouldn't work. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. He needed his dad. He needed someone to explain. He needed the world to stop spinning. At his locker, the officers found the case. They opened it, saw the replica, and their faces changed. For a moment, Officer Daniels hesitated. Something didn't look quite right about the weapon. But Patricia Holbrook was there, insistent, righteous in her certainty. "It's a gun. I know what I saw. That boy is dangerous." They took Terrell to the police station. They called his father. And while Julian Washington was racing across the city, his heart pounding with terror, his son sat in an interrogation room, still in handcuffs, rocking back and forth, unable to speak, living every autistic person's nightmare. The interrogation room was cold and the lights hummed with a frequency that made Terrell want to crawl out of his skin. Detective Lisa Morrison sat across from him, her expression somewhere between concern and suspicion. She'd been told she was dealing with a dangerous student who'd brought a weapon to school. But the kid in front of her didn't match that description. He was small for 13, tears streaming down his face, making repetitive movements with his hands despite the handcuffs, and hadn't said a single word since arriving. "Terrell, I need you to talk to me," Detective Morrison said, trying to soften her voice. "Why did you bring a gun to school?" But Terrell couldn't answer. His brain had shut down the way it did when everything became too overwhelming. He could hear the detective's words but couldn't make his mouth form responses. He wanted to tell her about his dad, about the prop, about the note that explained everything, but the words were trapped inside him, unreachable. Patricia Holbrook had followed the police to the station, playing the role of concerned teacher, giving her statement with theatrical worry. "He's been unstable all year. I've documented everything. Outbursts. Refusal to follow directions. I knew something like this would happen. Thank God I caught it before anyone got hurt." When Julian Washington burst through the police station doors 30 minutes later, he was a storm of panic and fury. His son had called him earlier that morning, excited about showing Mr. Henderson the prop. Now Julian's mind was racing through every worst-case scenario. He was a black father in America, and his autistic son had been arrested at school. The statistics, the stories, the videos of things going horribly wrong, they all flooded his mind. "Where is my son? Where is Terrell?" Julian demanded at the front desk, his 6'3" frame towering over the officer behind the glass. "Sir, you need to calm down." "Don't tell me to calm down. That's my 13-year-old child. He's autistic, he doesn't process situations like this. Where is he?" Detective Morrison came out to meet him, and Julian's heart sank when he saw her expression. "Mr. Washington, your son brought what appears to be a firearm to school. We need to ask you some questions." "It's not a firearm. It's a prop. I make props for movies, it's what I do. There should have been a note, there should have been labels, where's the case?" They brought out the case and Julian's hands trembled as he picked it up. The label was there, clear as day, theatrical prop, not a real weapon, Washington authentic replicas. The envelope with his detailed explanation letter was still sealed inside, unopened. "Did anyone read this?" Julian held up the envelope, his voice breaking. "Did anyone look at the label before you handcuffed my child?" The silence in the room was deafening. Detective Morrison took the envelope, opened it, read Julian's carefully written explanation. Her face went pale. "This is a movie prop," she said quietly. "It's for a World War II film. He was supposed to show it to his history teacher for a class project." "Where's my son?" Julian's voice was steel now, all the fear crystallizing into cold fury. They took him to the interrogation room. When Julian saw Terrell, still handcuffed, rocking, tears streaming down his face, something inside him cracked. He rushed forward, pulling his son into his arms as best he could with the restraints still on. "I'm here, buddy. I'm here. It's okay. Dad's got you." Terrell collapsed into his father's chest, finally finding his voice in broken sobs. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry. I tried to tell them but I couldn't talk and she kept saying I was bad and they put the handcuffs on and it hurt and I couldn't make it stop." "You have nothing to be sorry for," Julian said, looking up at Detective Morrison with eyes that could cut glass. "Take these handcuffs off my son. Now." The cuffs came off. Julian held Terrell for a long time, letting him cry, letting him stim, letting him be. And while he held his son, his mind was working through everything that had just happened. The teacher who'd called the police. The failure to check the obvious labels and documentation. The way his son had been treated like a criminal for being black and different. Can you believe they handcuffed a 13-year-old autistic child without even checking if the accusation was true? What would you do in Julian's position? Let us know in the comments below. They were finally allowed to leave, but Julian knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He took Terrell home, made him his favorite meal, let him decompress in the quiet safety of his room with his noise-canceling headphones and his familiar routines. And then Julian made phone calls. The first call was to Marcus Chin, his lawyer and friend for 15 years. Marcus had helped Julian build his business from nothing, had protected his patents, had been there for every contract negotiation. Now Julian needed him for something far more important. They did what? Marcus's voice rose in disbelief as Julian explained the situation. "Julian, the prop was clearly labeled. There was a written explanation. This is outrageous." "It's worse than that," Julian said, his voice tight. "I want you to request every piece of documentation from the school. Every note the teacher made about Terrell. Every complaint. Every incident report. Because I guarantee you, Marcus, when we look at it, we're going to see a pattern." The second call was to Dr. Ramona Foster, an educational rights advocate who specialized in cases involving neurodivergent students. Julian had met her at a conference years ago, never thinking he'd need her services for his own son. "Julian Washington," Dr. Foster said warmly, then her tone shifted as she heard the strain in his voice. "What's wrong?" He told her. "Everything." And when he finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I've seen this before," Dr. Foster said finally. "Too many times. A teacher with biases against a neurodivergent student, especially a black neurodivergent student, builds a narrative. They document behaviors out of context, interpret normal autism traits as aggression or defiance, and then when something happens, anything happens, they see it through that distorted lens as confirmation of what they already believed." "So what do we do?" Julian asked. "We fight," Dr. Foster said simply. "And we make sure this never happens to another family." The third call Julian made was to someone unexpected. Cameron Price was a documentary filmmaker who'd used Julian's props in his last 3 films. They'd become friends over the years, bonding over their shared passion for authentic storytelling. Cameron had recently pivoted to investigative journalism, exposing injustices in educational systems. "I want to tell this story," Julian said. "Not for revenge. But because if this happened to Terrell, it's happening to other kids. And people need to see it." Cameron agreed immediately. "I'll start tomorrow." Over the next 2 weeks, while Terrell stayed home from school, recovering from the trauma with the help of a therapist who specialized in autism and PTSD, Julian's team went to work. Marcus Chin filed a formal complaint with the school board and requested all documentation related to Terrell under FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. What came back was damning. Patricia Holbrook had filed 23 incident reports about Terrell in just 2 months of school. 23. Each one describing normal autistic behaviors as disciplinary issues. Student refused to make eye contact during conversation, was written as defiance. Student left classroom without permission, was a behavioral problem, even though Terrell had a documented accommodation allowing him to leave when overwhelmed. Student displayed aggressive hand movements, was describing stimming. On and on, a paper trail of bias disguised as concern. But there was more. Marcus dug deeper and found that Patricia Holbrook had been sued twice before for discrimination, cases that had been quietly settled by the school district with confidentiality agreements. One involved a Hispanic student with ADHD. Another involved a black student with dyslexia. The pattern was clear, and the school had known about it and done nothing. Dr. Foster reached out to other families at Riverside Middle School. Within days, she had statements from 8 other parents of neurodivergent students who'd had problems with Mrs. Holbrook. Stories of children coming home in tears, of accommodations being ignored, of complaints to the administration going nowhere. Cameron Price started filming. He interviewed Julian and Terrell with Terrell's consent and on his terms, letting the teenager take breaks when needed, respecting his communication style. He interviewed the other families. He got statements from experts on autism, on implicit bias, on the school-to-prison pipeline that disproportionately affected black and disabled students. He made Freedom of Information requests to the police department about their protocols for dealing with minors and disabled individuals. And he found something explosive. Officer Daniels, the lead officer who'd handcuffed Terrell, had body camera footage that contradicted Patricia Holbrook's statement. On the recording she could be heard saying, "You need to be rough with him. He's violent. Don't let him manipulate you with that autism thing." The autism thing. As if Terrell's neurodivergence was an act, a manipulation, rather than a fundamental part of who he was. The footage also showed that the officers had indeed noticed the label on the prop case before opening it. One officer had pointed it out, suggesting they verify with someone before assuming it was real. Patricia Holbrook had insisted they couldn't wait, that Terrell was dangerous, that they needed to act immediately. 3 weeks after the incident, Julian walked into a school board meeting with Marcus Chin, Dr. Foster, Cameron Price, and 15 other parents. The meeting room was packed with community members, alerted by social media posts about what had happened to Terrell. Local news cameras were there. The school board members looked nervous. Julian took the microphone during public comment. His hands were steady now, his voice clear. Terrell sat beside him, headphones on, his father's hand on his shoulder. "My name is Julian Washington. 3 weeks ago, my 13-year-old autistic son was handcuffed and arrested at school because a teacher saw a clearly labeled movie prop and decided to see a weapon instead. She decided to see a threat instead of a child. But this isn't really a story about a misunderstanding. This is a story about bias, about failure, and about a system that protects teachers like Patricia Holbrook while traumatizing children like my son." He presented the evidence. The incident reports that documented autism as defiance. The history of discrimination complaints. The body camera footage that showed Patricia Holbrook coaching police to be rough with a disabled child. The statements from other families whose children had been similarly mistreated. "Mrs. Holbrook called police on my son without checking the obvious labels, without asking questions, without showing an ounce of the care she was supposed to have as an educator. And when she gave her statement to police, she lied. She called my son violent and aggressive when he's never been anything but a sweet kid trying to navigate a world that isn't built for brains like his. She told them to be rough with him. With a child. A disabled child. My child." The room was silent except for the sound of people crying. "I make props for a living," Julian continued. "Fake guns, fake jewels, fake artifacts. Things that look real but aren't. Mrs. Holbrook made my son into something fake too. She made him into her projection, her prejudice. She took a brilliant, kind, different kid and turned him into her assumptions about what a black boy, especially a black disabled boy, must be. And this school district let her do it." The school board president tried to respond, tried to offer the standard deflections and promises to look into it, but the community wasn't having it. Parent after parent took the microphone, sharing their own stories of bias and discrimination at Riverside and other schools in the district. Teachers came forward, speaking anonymously, about how concerns about Mrs. Holbrook had been ignored by administration for years. If you've stayed with us this far in Terrell's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button because you need to hear what happened next. This story is far from over. 2 days after the school board meeting, Cameron Price released his documentary online. The Replica, How Bias Nearly Destroyed a Boy, went viral within hours. It was picked up by national news outlets. Civil rights organizations issued statements. The hashtag Justice for Terrell began trending. Patricia Holbrook was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The police department announced a review of their protocols for responding to calls involving minors and disabled individuals. And the school board, under intense public pressure, couldn't hide anymore. But Julian wasn't satisfied with half measures. With Marcus Chen's guidance, he filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Patricia Holbrook, the school district and the police department, alleging discrimination based on disability and race, failure to accommodate and violation of Terrell's constitutional rights. The lawsuit laid out everything in excruciating detail. How Patricia Holbrook had targeted Terrell from his first day in her class. How the school administration had ignored complaints about her pattern of bias. How the police had failed to follow their own protocols by not de-escalating or involving crisis intervention specialists trained to work with disabled individuals. How a clearly labeled prop had been treated as a weapon because of assumptions about who Terrell was rather than evidence about what he'd actually done. Discovery in the lawsuit revealed even more. Emails between Patricia Holbrook and other teachers where she made explicitly prejudiced statements about students of color and disabled students. Complaints from parents that had been buried by administrators. Evidence that the school district had known about her behavior for years but had protected her because addressing it would open them up to liability. The case never went to trial. 6 months after Terrell's arrest, the school district settled for $7.5 million. The money would go into a trust for Terrell's future and would fund a new educational rights advocacy organization led by Dr. Foster, dedicated to protecting neurodivergent students of color. But more important than the money were the other terms of the settlement. Patricia Holbrook was terminated and would never teach again. The school district had to implement comprehensive training on autism, disability rights and implicit bias for all staff. They had to revise their discipline and emergency protocols to protect disabled students. They had to create an oversight committee with parent representatives to review complaints about discrimination. And they had to issue a public apology to Terrell and commit to doing better. The police department implemented new protocols too. Officers would now receive training on interacting with autistic and other neurodivergent individuals. Body camera footage would be automatically reviewed in cases involving disabled minors. And crisis intervention specialists would be required to respond to all calls involving students with documented disabilities. But the story doesn't end with settlements and policy changes, because the real question is about Terrell himself. How do you recover from something like that? How does a 13-year-old move forward after being handcuffed and treated like a criminal for being different? Terrell went to therapy twice a week for months. He worked with Dr. James Okonkwo, a therapist who was himself autistic and who understood the unique trauma of being neurodivergent in a world that often saw difference as danger. Slowly, painfully, Terrell began to process what had happened to him. He didn't go back to Riverside Middle School. Julian enrolled him in a specialized school for neurodivergent students, a place where his accommodations weren't just tolerated but built into the fabric of everything they did. Where teachers understood that eye contact wasn't respect, that stimming wasn't misbehavior, that being different was completely okay. And something beautiful happened. Away from Patricia Holbrook's prejudice, away from an environment that had told him he was wrong just for being himself, Terrell thrived. His new history teacher, Mr. Calloway, loved hearing about Terrell's special interests. When Terrell finally felt safe enough to bring in one of his father's props again, the entire class was fascinated. Mr. Calloway invited Julian to do a presentation about his work, and Terrell beamed with pride as his father explained the art and science of creating movie props. Terrell started writing too. With support from his therapist, he wrote about his experience, processing his trauma through words. He wrote about what it felt like to be misunderstood, to be seen as threatening when all he wanted was to be himself. He wrote about the fear of being handcuffed, of being unable to speak, of being treated like he was dangerous. And he wrote about hope, about the people who'd fought for him, about his father who never gave up. Cameron Price helped Terrell turn his writing into a short film. With Julian's help, they created a movie that showed the world through Terrell's eyes. They used Julian's props, but this time the props were used to tell Terrell's story. The film premiered at an Autism Advocacy conference and received a standing ovation. Viewers weren't just moved, they were changed. They saw autism differently, understood it better, recognized their own biases. Julian watched his son share his story and felt something shift in his chest. The man who'd spent 20 years creating fake things for movies had just helped his son create something completely real. And it mattered in ways props never could. 2 years after the incident, on a crisp October morning that mirrored the day everything had gone wrong, Terrell stood in front of the state legislature. He was 15 now, taller, more confident, his voice steady. Dr. Foster stood beside him, along with representatives from disability rights organizations across the state. They were there to advocate for what would become known as Terrell's Law, legislation requiring schools to implement specific protections for neurodivergent students, mandatory training on autism and disability for all educators and school police officers, and strict accountability measures for cases of discrimination. "My name is Terrell Washington," he said, reading from a prepared statement, taking breaks when he needed to, his father in the front row. "2 years ago, a teacher decided I was dangerous because I'm black and autistic. She didn't see me. She saw her assumptions. And because of that, I was handcuffed and arrested for bringing a clearly labeled movie prop to school. What happened to me was wrong. But what's more wrong is that it keeps happening to other kids like me." He spoke about the statistics. About how disabled students, especially disabled students of color, were dramatically more likely to be disciplined, arrested, and funneled into the criminal justice system for behaviors related to their disabilities. About how implicit bias turned difference into threat, turned children into criminals in the eyes of people who should have protected them. "I'm one of the lucky ones," Terrell continued. "My dad had resources to fight back. He had connections, a lawyer, people who believed us. But there are hundreds, thousands of kids like me who don't have that, who are being hurt right now by systems that don't understand them and don't try to. We have to do better. We have to be better." The legislature passed Terrell's law with bipartisan support. It became a model for other states. Terrell's story, as painful as it was, became a catalyst for change that would protect countless other neurodivergent students from experiencing what he'd gone through. Patricia Holbrook never apologized. She left the state, changed her name, and disappeared from public view. But her absence didn't erase the harm she'd caused. Terrell still had nightmares sometimes about handcuffs and fluorescent lights. He still struggled with trusting new teachers. The trauma didn't just disappear because justice had been served. But Terrell also had something else. He had a father who'd fought for him with everything he had. He had a community that had rallied around him. He had found his voice and used it to help others. He had learned that being different wasn't wrong, that the problem wasn't him, that he deserved to be seen for who he really was. Julian continued making props, but he also became an advocate. He spoke at conferences about disability rights, about parenting neurodivergent children, about the intersection of race and disability. He used his platform in the entertainment industry to push for better representation of autistic characters, for authentic portrayals, for stories told by and about neurodivergent people. His workshop, Washington Authentic Replicas, started hiring neurodivergent employees, creating a workspace designed around different needs and abilities. It became known as one of the most inclusive employers in the industry. The money from the settlement sat in trust for Terrell's future, but the real inheritance Julian gave his son wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that he was worth fighting for, that his voice mattered, that being different was beautiful. 3 years after the incident, Terrell published a book. The Replica, My Story, was part memoir, part advocacy guide, written in Terrell's own voice with all its unique perspective and brilliant insight. The book became required reading in education programs across the country. Teachers learned from Terrell's words what autism really looked like, what it felt like, how to support students like him rather than punishing them for being who they were. In the book's final chapter, Terrell wrote about forgiveness, but not in the way people expected. He didn't forgive Patricia Holbrook, because she'd never asked for forgiveness or acknowledged the harm she'd caused. Instead, he wrote about forgiving himself for all the times he'd thought he was the problem. For all the times he'd tried to force himself to make eye contact, to sit still, to be normal in ways that caused him pain. He forgave himself for being exactly who he was. "I'm not a replica," Terrell wrote. "For a long time I tried to be. I tried to be a copy of what people expected, of what would make teachers like Mrs. Holbrook comfortable. But replicas aren't real. They're fake versions, safe versions, versions that don't challenge anything. I don't want to be safe in that way anymore. I want to be authentic. Even if it's messy. Even if it's different. Especially because it's different." Those words resonated with thousands of neurodivergent people who read them. They resonated with parents fighting for their children. They resonated with educators trying to do better. They changed conversations and opened minds. And on a crisp October morning 5 years after everything had gone so wrong, Terrell Washington stood in front of Riverside Middle School, but this time he wasn't being dragged out in handcuffs. He was there as a keynote speaker for a district-wide conference on neurodiversity and inclusive education. The same building that had been the site of his trauma had become a place where his voice, his wisdom, and his experience were being celebrated. Julian stood at the back of the auditorium, watching his son speak to hundreds of educators. Terrell was 18 now, preparing for college, considering a career in advocacy or maybe filmmaking, still figuring out who he wanted to be. He was still autistic, still stymied, still needed accommodations and support. But he was thriving in ways that once seemed impossible on that terrible day when handcuffs bit into his wrists. In the face of bias and injustice, Terrell told the educators gathered before him, "We don't just survive. We change the system so the next kid doesn't have to go through what we did." That's not just courage. That's love. Love for ourselves, for our community, for every different, beautiful, authentic person who deserves to be seen for who they really are. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Teachers who'd once walked past Terrell's arrest without questioning it were crying, recognizing their own failures, committing to do better. Administrators who'd protected Patricia Holbrook were gone, replaced by people who actually cared about protecting children. The school that had failed Terrell so catastrophically had become a model for inclusive education because of his story and his advocacy. And Julian Washington, the man who spent his life making fake things look real, watched his son be authentically, beautifully himself, and knew that this was the most important thing he'd ever created. Not a prop, not a replica, but a space where his son could be real. The story of Terrell Washington is a reminder that bias doesn't just exist in obvious acts of hatred. It lives in assumptions, in the refusal to see people for who they really are, in the choice to view difference as threat rather than beauty. But it's also a reminder that change is possible, that voices matter, that one family's fight for justice can transform systems and save countless other families from experiencing the same trauma. Terrell still has the prop that started everything, the replica 1945 Colt pistol that his father made for a movie. It sits on a shelf in his room, a reminder of the day his world shattered and of everything that came after. It's just a fake gun, a piece of resin and paint that could never hurt anyone. But it represents something true, the way we see what we expect to see, the way bias can turn the harmless into the dangerous, and the way authentic courage can transform trauma into change. In the face of bias and injustice, courage and determination don't just help us survive. They help us build a world where every child, regardless of how their brain works or what they look like, gets to be seen for who they truly are. Where difference isn't dangerous. Where being authentic isn't a crime. Where teachers protect instead of harm. Where police help instead of handcuff. Where systems serve children instead of failing them. That's the world Terrell Washington is fighting for. And because of his story, because of his voice, because of his refusal to be anything other than authentically himself, that world is becoming a little more real every day. Not a replica. The real thing.